Hello and welcome to this Cantabile walkthrough. Today I'm going to be talking about bindings, which serve two main purposes in Cantabile. The first is for controlling Cantabile from an external MIDI control device like a keyboard or a MIDI control surface, and the other is for sending MIDI data out when a song is loaded. So for example, configuring a sound module to load a particular instrument by sending a program change event, for example. Before we get started, let me just explain what I've set up here. Rather than using a physical device here that you can't see off screen, I've set up some controllers here to simulate a physical device. Whatever I do down here, you would typically do on your actual physical keyboard or control surface. And just to show how these are configured, let me just bring up this MIDI monitor. So I've got CC16 mapped as a slider, 17 as a slider as well. 18 and 19 are momentary buttons, so buttons that you just press release. 20 is configured as a switch, so it's press on, press off, with a light to indicate whether it's on or not. And Cantabile can't simulate a rotary encoder, but I've set two buttons here to simulate turning a rotary encoder to the right or turning it up, and turning it to the left or turning it down. Okay, so yeah, just remember anything I do down here you would typically do on your actual physical keyboard. Right, so let's start by creating a binding. Let's have a look at this slider here is Cantabile's master output gain. It's something you typically might want to control via a knob or slider on your keyboard rather than reaching for the mouse and fiddling with this. So the way to create a binding for this would be to simply right click, choose create binding, and you'll see this window appear. And you'll see that it's saying that it's waiting to move the MIDI controller. So this is trying to learn which controller that we're going to bind. So I'm just going to go and move CC16, and you'll see it's picked that up, controller 16 on main keyboard, and we want to bind it to the master output gain. So I'm just going to press OK, and you'll see now that as I move this controller, Cantabile's master output gain is moving. Most settings in Cantabile will have that right-click create binding. So for example, if you wanted to bind to the metronome tempo, if you wanted to bind to the metronome volume, if you wanted to bind to set lists, states, etc. Most things will have a binding for that, as you can see here. The other kind of binding that you often want to do is to a plugin parameter. So if I just open this plugin, the way you bind to plugin parameters is slightly different. Just choose create parameter binding from this menu, and then the process is very similar. Move the source controller, so I'm going to use CC17, and then bind to, you move the control that you want to adjust with that controller. So I'm just going to move this one, detune, so we're going to map controller 17 onto the detune parameter, press OK, and you can see that that binding is now created. Okay. These bindings are created and stored in the bindings panel here. So you can see here the two bindings that I just created, the CC16 onto the master output gain and 17 onto the detune parameter. The way this panel works is the left half is basically where the event is coming from, so the source of the binding, and the right half is what you're binding to. And this last column defines the mapping between the two. Okay, so you can see here that we've got CC values 0 to 127 mapped onto completely silent to +7 dB, and similar here for the detune setting. I'll go into this in a bit more detail in a minute. First of all, I just want to cover this. So one of the important things to recognize with MIDI CCs is that the buttons and knobs can send different values depending on what it is, as I showed down here before. So for instance, here we've selected to choose just a straight controller with a range of 0 to 127 onto a value, which is the output gain. Depending on what you want to bind to, you might want to map these differently. So a fine controller is a controller which has a more precise value over the range of the knob or slider. A button controller and a no-edge button controller. So a button controller sends 0 when it's released and 127 when it's pressed. A no-edge button just sends typically a non-zero value every time it's pressed. These can generally be used interchangeably, but sometimes you might have to tweak that. And then the other kind of controller is a switch, where every time you press it, it alternates between sending 127 and 0. So to demonstrate these button controllers, I'm just going to create another binding to the record button. So we're creating a binding to record start stop, and I'm going to bind CC18. Okay, so I'm just going to create that. And you'll see that it's detected that it needs to be a button controller, because it doesn't make sense to map a value onto start stop the recorder. So it's defaulted to no edge button. And it said that every time you press it, it's going to toggle that setting. So if I hit CC18 now, you'll see the recorder starts, hit it again and it stops. Okay, so that's a toggle binding. The other way you might configure this is as a switch binding. So I'm just going to delete that and recreate it on the other controller. So CC20, this time onto record start stop. But this time this is a switch button. So what I'm going to do is change that from a no edge button to a switch. And you'll see now, when I press it, it starts recording. When I release it, it stops recording. So it's a subtle difference, but if your keyboard supports this kind of controller, and as I mentioned before, they often have a light associated with them, that way you can see at a glance as well whether the setting is enabled or not. This last setting in the value mapping just lets you do it the opposite way around. So now when the controller is on, it stops recording and starts when it's off. Not used very often, but occasionally that's a handy thing to have. Okay, the other way that these type of bindings can be made to work is with two different buttons. So let me just delete this, and I'm going to create this binding yet again. So this time I'm going to CC18 onto record start stop, and I'm going to say this time, rather than toggling, I want to turn on, and I'm just going to copy paste this binding. And for the other button, which is CC19, I'm going to say it's going to turn off. So you can see now I've got 18 mapped to on, 19 to off. So I can now start, stop, start, stop, oops, stop, start, stop. Okay, so you can see here you can configure this pretty much any way you like to do exactly what you need, what you prefer. Okay, I mentioned before about this value range, so let's have a closer look at this. The first thing I want to show you is what's called jump prevention. So before I do that, let me just show you. So the idea here is that if you have a value which is currently down here, but your knob or slider is right up here, what you'll notice is when I move this slider for the very first time, watch the master gain setting, you'll see it jumps the first time I move it. What you can do to prevent that is turn on jump prevention. So if I go into here and turn on absolute with jump prevention, and I'll just quickly disable this binding so that I can get them out of sync. If I move this down to here, right, so you can see that we've got the CC value is currently right up here, the binding is right down here. You turn this binding back on, what you'll notice, I don't know why that didn't work. What you'll notice is that the slider isn't tracking the master control until it connects with it. So it's now tracking, it's connected. Okay, so just to show that again, and just turn that off. Move this slider down, turn it back on. Right, so you'll notice there's no effect yet until it catches it, and then it will start tracking it. So the idea behind that is to stop big jumps when you move a controller if they get out of sync, typically after switching songs or changing states, something like that. Okay, the other way you can map these MIDI controllers is with what's called relative mode. So this is typically used for rotary encoders, and the idea behind this is that it uses an endless knob. So rather than the knob sending its current position, it sends direction changes. So if you turn it to the right, it will send one value. If you turn it to the left, it will send another value. So I'm just going to switch this to 2's complement relative mode, which is a fairly common mode for rotary encoders. And I'm going to be using these buttons here, which are on CC80. So let me just change that to CC80. And what you'll see now is as I turn the knob to the right, simulated by pressing this button, you can see the volume goes up, and to the left the volume goes down. So the good thing about rotary encoders, if your device supports them, is that your knob, or you can only get a knob rotary encoder, you can't get that on a slider, is that they basically can't get out of sync because they're sending a direction change rather than an absolute value. The other thing you might find with relative encoders is that they're not moving fast enough or slow enough. So you can adjust the scaling here. So if I was to set this to 500%, for example, you'll notice that the value jumps a lot quicker. So you can use that to adjust the speed of a rotary encoder, should you need to. Okay, I'm just going to set all this back to how it was. Now, so far everything I've been setting up here has been song level bindings. So these bindings are being associated with this song, which is currently unsaved, but nevertheless it is assigned with this song. So these bindings will only work when this song is loaded and working. Often you'll have bindings that you want to work across all songs, and the way you support that is with what's called the background rack. So I'm just going to take this binding here, the first one, for the master output gain. That's a typical setting that you would want to work across all songs. So I'm just going to cut that and go to the background rack. Okay, so the background rack is like a song. You can see I'm editing the background rack here, indicated by this. Is like a song file that's always running in the background. So anything you put in here will have effect across all loaded songs. So I've put this binding into here now. So now, regardless of which song is active, this binding will still adjust the master output gain. Okay, so I'm going to close this song. I'm not even going to save it. Create a new song. Don't save. No, but this binding is still active. Okay, so the other time you would use the background rack is for bindings related to your set list, for example, or anything that's global across all your songs. For example, let me just quickly create a couple of songs here and put them in a set list. So I'm just going to save this set list as demo, and then I'm just going to create a couple of songs. Song 1, put it in the set list. Song 2, put it in the set list too. Song 3. Okay, so this is your set list here. You can see I can switch between them here. This is something that you would want to be able to control from your control surface. So let's go into the background rack and create a couple of bindings here. So the other way you can learn these bindings is just go add binding learn. So I'm going to create a binding from CC19. Okay, and I'm going to say that I want to control the set list and I want to load the next song instantly. And I'm going to create another binding. I'm just going to copy paste this one for CC18, and it's going to load the previous song. Okay, so you can see I've got 18 and 19 now mapped to the next and previous song. So if I can go in here now, you can see by pressing these buttons on your keyboard, you can cycle through your set list. The other thing you can do here is often you'll have a keyboard, MIDI control keyboard that doesn't have any spare buttons on them. And what a lot of people like to do is use a note at the bottom end of their keyboard or sometimes the top end of their keyboard that they never play to control things like this set list. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. It's very similar. I'm just going to go back into the background rack. I'll just delete these two bindings to show you how to set this up. So I'm just going to learn the binding again. And I'm going to say this note here, which is D1. You can see here it's picked up a number of events. It's asking here how you want to interpret those events. We're saying we want note D1, and we're going to map that to the same thing, the set list, the next song. And I'm going to create another binding, and I'm going to map C1, which is this one, and I'm going to map it to the set list as well, but to the previous song. Okay, so we've now mapped D1 to the next song, C1 to the previous song. Just save that. Okay, so now you'll see that if I use these two notes, I can cycle through my set list. Okay, now there's one catch to this, and that is that how do we stop these notes from actually playing a sound? So let me just put a plugin in here, just something quick. And let me save all of this. And so you'll see now if I press D1, you'll hear the note as I transition to the next song. Okay, so we don't really want that. So the way we handle that is if we go back to our bindings in the background rack, each of these bindings has a routing mode. Okay, and by default it's set to continue. So what that means is once this route has been matched and the target invoked, it continues searching through the list for other things that might be bound to the same thing. So you can actually bind the same note to do multiple things or the same controller to do multiple things. But in this case, we don't want the note to sound out. We actually want to suppress it. So if I just set the routing mode to suppress, then anything after this and any plugins that are connected to it won't get that event. And I'll do the same for this one. Right, so they're both now set to suppress. So if we now go back to here, you'll see that those notes don't sound, but any other note will. Okay, that's mostly covers incoming bindings. So in other words, controlling Cantabile and plugins and so forth from an external device. The next thing I want to talk about is the other way, which is controlling or sending MIDI data to an external device. Typically when something inside Cantabile happens. And the classic example of this is sending a program change to an external sound module when a song loads. So let's take this song here, it's as good as any, and we'll just go to its bindings tab, and we're just going to add a binding. These are all things that you can bind from. So we're going to bind from the song, and it has an onload event here that we can bind from. Okay, so we're saying when the song loads, there's no event here, the event is simply onloading. What we want to do is to the external synth module, which is just a MIDI port that I have configured here, we want to send a program change, just a plain program change will do, and we want to say choose program 33, which would be the program number of the instrument that you want to use on that external module. Now we can test these bindings here by clicking the play button. And I've got this configured. You can see here in the background I've got the console logger running, which will show any outgoing MIDI events. So if I just hit play here, you'll see that it's sending program 32, which is the actual program number for program 33. Cantabile, the way I've got it configured, is displaying them one based, which means they're one higher than the actual value actually sent. So that is actually the correct value. Okay, so we can see that we've configured song 1 on its load to send program change 33. So if I now save all this, and then if I switch to the next song, and then back again, you'll see when this song loads, it's sent that program. I could create a similar bindings on these other songs to send similar events. Okay, but you can see now every time I load song 1, this external device is being mapped correctly to the correct program. The other way you can use these bindings is for states. So let's say, for example, this, I'll just get rid of this binding. Let's say, for example, this song had 3 states. Let's call them intro, verse 1, and chorus 1. What we can do is we can create a binding here, and this time we're going to do it from the song state. I'm going to say on load, and we're going to do it set up a similar thing. External synth, we're going to send a program change. Let's set it to say 33. Now let me just come back to here. So what's happening here is every time we switch states in this song, it's going to send a program change 33. And what we actually want is we want to be able to send different program changes for each state. So if we look at the state behaviors for this binding and we turn on target, what that means is this binding will get a separate set of values on this right-hand side for each state. So what I can do is I can go back to the intro. I can say, right, the intro we want program 33. On verse 1 we want program 45. And on the chorus we want program 78, for example. And you can see that as I switch through these states now, those various program changes will be getting sent out. So there's our 33, there's the 45, and there's the 77. Okay. Now the other thing you might want to do here is you might have a state where you don't want to send a program change. In that case, we'll tell it to also control the enabled behavior. And for this second verse, we'll just turn it off. So you can see now we'll get 32, no program change there, and 78 on that last one. Okay, so as you can see, these song and state load bindings are fairly powerful. You can use them to configure as much MIDI gear as you want. You could have a whole stack of these listed out to different channels, to different devices, sending all sorts of program changes, control changes, whatever you need. And you can also send or execute external scripts. So for example, in here I can say external script. I can configure it and I can get it to run Notepad, launch PDF viewer to bring up my lyrics, whatever you need to control. I've even heard of people using this to control lighting rigs and all sorts of things. The other interesting thing you might like to do here is send sysx data. So for instance, suppose this external synth needed some sort of sysx configuration. You can do that in here. You can send, for example, configure your data here. You can also put quite complicated expressions in here to generate sysx data as you need it. I'm not going to cover that here, but if you go to the help here, you'll see that there's a fairly detailed guide on setting all that up. Okay. The other way you can use these bindings is in racks. So you'll see that so far I've been putting these bindings either on the song or in the background rack, but any rack in Cantabile also has these same bindings. So if I was to create a new link rack here, just call it test. Inside here in this rack, I also have a set of bindings here that are specific to this rack, and typically you would bind from the rack's MIDI in to do whatever you need to do in this rack. And then what you can do is you can send MIDI events to the rack to configure it, make it behave in certain ways, respond to pedals, etc. Okay, that's most of what you'll ever need to deal with racks. Just a couple more things. Let me just... You can also create bindings to routes. If you look in this bindings panel, you see, let me just quickly put something in here. Okay, actually that was a bad choice because I got that bound in the background rack as well. Let me just clear this out. Okay, if you're manually creating these routes just by clicking the add binding here, you'll see that everything that's in your song will be listed out. So for example, this plugin here is listed in the binding targets here. So I can bind either to settings directly on the piano, MDA piano, or I can actually send MIDI events to its MIDI input port, either one. But what you won't notice here is there's nothing here for binding to the routes in your song. So for example, oops. In this routing panel, if I wanted to control, say, the gain on this stereo output port, there's nowhere in this bindings panel where I can find that. And the trick here is that you need to give the route a name first. So if I just select that route and then choose Edit, Rename, and let's call it MDA Piano Stereo Out, then you'll see that over here I can now create a binding target to it, and I can adjust its gain, for example. So if I was to come back here now, you should see that I'm now controlling that route's gain directly. It's just a trick to remember that with the routes you need to give them a name before you can bind to them. If you're using the create binding, you actually don't need to remember that. For instance, if I was to come here, create binding here, it'll tell me you must give the route a name. Do you want to give this name a route now? Yes, MIDI in route, whatever. And then you can bind to it. Okay, so just remember that with routes, if you want to bind to a route, you need to give it a name first. Okay, the final thing I wanted to cover just quickly, because it is kind of advanced, is what's called MIDI reflection, which is the ability to take a setting inside Cantabile and reflect it out to a MIDI device. So this is a bit different to just sending configuration data. This is actually reflecting a value out to an external device. So I'm just going to put in a plugin here, MDA plugin again, because it loads quickly. And what I'm going to show here is how to map a setting inside this plugin to an external MIDI device. So let's take the gain for example. If I go to the bindings panel and choose the MDA piano as the source, and I can choose its gain setting, and then what I can say I want to do is I want to send MIDI events whenever this gain value changes. So let's send them to our external synth, and let's send them on controller 7. So we're going to map, it's got the same sort of range mappings, okay, so source gain range here to a target CC range. And what will happen now is Cantabile will send CC7 every time the gain on that plugin changes. You can see these events coming out the bottom. Okay, so that's a way that you can reflect settings inside Cantabile back to an external sound module or display device or whatever you need. Okay, so that's most of the basics of bindings. There's quite a few other things you can do with them, including using song and state load bindings to send events to racks internally to Cantabile. Various other things that you can do with them as well. But I think I've covered probably 90% of what you would ever want to use them for. There's also a guide for these if you need more information at cantabilesoftware.com, guides, and you'll find that there's a section here on bindings, and that'll give a more detailed explanation of what I've been through. Okay, so that's it for bindings. I hope you found this useful, and thanks for watching.